Good evening, everybody. It's not on. Is this test 1 2? Test 1 2 1 2. Test 1 2 1 2 1 2. It's not, now it's on. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this week, the week that we commemorate Kristallnacht. And we have a wonderful book review and talk this evening. Thank you to Alex Bruner for coming this evening. Thank you to our friends of music and the arts, our group of members who support the arts and all of the programming. And I just want to highlight some of the things that are coming up. Oh, we're going to have some cookies afterwards, a little nosh, so we can all talk afterwards. Thank you to our friends of music and arts. This next weekend, not this weekend, but the following weekend, we're going to have Cantor Jake's consecration weekend with guest cantor Robbie Solomon. He's going to be down from Boston. He'll be at the Friday night consecration service November 15th. Saturday morning, there'll be a beautiful musical Torah study that Cantor Solomon will conduct. And on Sunday, November 17th at 7 p.m., we will have Cantor Jake in concert. It's going to be a great concert. He's been working very hard. You can purchase tickets on our website. We're going to be showing a wonderful film on Sunday, December 1st, called The Blind Spot. The Blind Spot is about antisemitism on our campuses. And there's going to be a talk back with one of our students who's a student at University of Pennsylvania and has become quite an activist, Maya Harpaz, and her mother, Pam. And there'll be a reception to follow that evening, and there will be a $10 charge that we will be donating to AJC, the American Jewish Committee. On December 11th, we're going to have a program called Hanukkah by Design with artist Jeanette Kuvan-Oren. Jeanette's the artist who created our Torah mantles. She designs art for Torah for synagogues all around the country. And she created the Hanukkah postage stamp this last year. So on December 11th, she's going to have a lesson about how she created that postage stamp, and then people are invited to learn how to do paper cutting with her. So we're going to have some wine and some cheese and some dessert and paper cutting, and hopefully we won't cut ourselves after drinking our wine. But it's going to be a great evening. On January 9th, save the date, we're going to do a day trip to the Delray Beach Playhouse to see the show Tova is Leona, a one-woman show starring Tova Feldsha as Leona Helmsley. So we're going to go up there. We're actually going to meet up there, and we're going to have a talk back in the pavilion with some wine and cheese following the matinee. So we will be selling tickets here. It will be on the website. You'll get a zillion emails about it, I promise you. And in January, we're going to be hosting artist in residence, Rabbi Debreczeni Mintz. And she's going to teach many sessions, and then there's going to be a concert that weekend with a group called New Moon Rising, which features Rabbi Mintz along with Ilana Arian, who's performed here, and Chava Morel, who we had last year for Slichot. We're going to have Rabbi Naomi Levy, who's an amazing speaker, and I don't know if you've read any of her books, Talking to God, To Begin Again. They are my life Bibles, and she is magical. And we're going to have Noah Aronson in concert at Congregation B'nai Israel in February for the annual Dubav concert, and also Cantor Michelle's going to be doing a concert, so please watch your announcements. It'll be in the Chronicle. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Rabbi Weisman to introduce our speaker this evening.
As you can tell from the cantor's remarks, there's nothing going on here at Temple Bethel in the next couple of weeks. Just before we begin, a couple of words. First, please take a moment to check your cell phones or your watches to make sure that they are off. Doesn't hurt to take a moment to also see where the exits are around the room in case there's a God forbid situation. But we are here this evening in commemoration of Kristallnacht, the night that in 1938 was not necessarily the beginning of the Shoah, but marked an important turning point, a terrible turning point in our people's history, when homes and businesses across Germany that were identified as Jewish were shattered in many different ways, thus the name, the Night of Broken Glass. And as we mark that occasion on the annual calendar with our program this evening, I wanted to offer a few words of prayer to get us going. And I don't know about you, but I'm a sucker for history. And I found a prayer that was written by the chief rabbi of the British Empire in the days after Kristallnacht in 1938. And so I'm going to read the last few lines of it, holding that moment in our people's history in mind, but also holding the last, now we are getting close to 14 months as our brethren across the world have been struck by what happened in Israel on October the 7th, the fact that we still have those who are held in captivity and others who are standing in harm's way trying to bring them home and keep us all safe. And so with that in mind, we offer these words of prayer. In our own hearts, plant your brotherly compassion, so that we hide not ourselves from our flesh and blood. May there be an increase in deeds of benevolence on behalf of the oppressed, till you lead them back from darkness unto light, and from righteousness unto freedom, and we sing a new song unto you, O our rock and our Redeemer. Almighty God, banish envy and causeless hatred from the hearts of peoples. Renew within them the spirit of justice and humanity, and your children shall dwell safe from uncharitableness and persecution. Hasten the days when the nations shall know that we have one sovereign, one parent, and one God has created us, and spread the tabernacle of your peace over all the dwellers on earth, to which we all together say, Amen. In those words of blessing, there is one that, in light of our topic of conversation tonight, for me jumped off the page, which is humanity. If you have had the experience of reading Cold Crematorium, you read an experience where there was so little humanity among those who had been taken prisoner, those holding them prisoner. There was so many opportunities in this book where someone could have done something for someone else in an act of humanity, and those opportunities came and went so frequently, so much so that what jumps off the page are those few moments when someone does. And we are privileged this evening to hear not from the author of blessed memory, but from his nephew, who has spent a good part of the last little bit of time bringing this book to fruition, but carrying the story of this memoir that was penned 60 years ago? Over 70 years ago. I forget what year it is. Over 70 years ago. And we'll talk about why it took this long for it to be in our hands, that we could embrace it and to read it. But I don't want to say too much because Alex is going to do such a great job of introducing the author and the story in his presentation. So I'm just going to hand it over to Alex Bruner and say it is with great thanks and appreciation that you have generously opened this part of your family to us and the words that you're going to share. So the way the program is going to go is Alex is going to speak at the beginning and talk a little bit about the story and his uncle and how we got here, and then we'll transition into some questions that I'll ask, and we'll have some time for questions from all of you as well. So Alex, please.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here. So today we're going to speak about my uncle, József. I called him Józsi, his nickname József Bruner, who took on the name Debreczeni, his writer's name. And we're going to be speaking about his book, Cold Crematorium, which is his very personal narrative about the horrific journey that he took through what he called the land of Auschwitz. The land of Auschwitz was the network of thousands of different camps where Jews were imprisoned and murdered during World War II. So this is, could we have the next slide, please? Okay. So there are the two of us. That was me a long time ago. That was my uncle, and we had a close relationship. And I sometimes look at that picture and I see, if you look carefully, you can see that love that he had, an appreciation that he had for me. I mentioned that he was a Bruner. He was born Bruner. He was my father's elder brother. And he chose the name Debreczeni as his pen name. Debrecen is a city, a town in Hungary, where the Bruners, when they came from Central Europe, first settled when they came to Hungary. Later on, they moved to Yugoslavia. So, if we could have the next slide, please. Cold Crematorium was published in, he wrote the book in Hungarian. Later on, I'll speak a little bit about his life. He was born in Budapest. Hungarian was his native language. He always felt most comfortable in Hungarian. Cold Crematorium was written in Hungarian in 1950. It was translated into Serbo-Croatian, all of this in Yugoslavia. So just to clarify, Yugoslavia was a multi-ethnic country. Hungarians were a minority. Hungarian was an official minority language. Serbo-Croatian was a language of about 70 to 80%, the majority language. Now, as soon as it came out, people recognized that it was something very special. And I think what this commentator wrote really captures it. Always present in this book, even behind the most mundane descriptions, are living beings which once visualized, even if illuminated for only a second, cannot be forgotten. And so he really makes you feel that you are right with him, experiencing what he's experiencing on his skin and with the other prisoners. So how was he able to do this? Well, he was a journalist. He had an eye for detail, but he was also a poet, and he was imbued with a poet's sensibility. So he was able to fuse really different elements. He used irony, he used sarcasm, he used even humor to really portray something that is intellectually very difficult to portray. In addition to that, and unlike some of the other very famous Holocaust masterpieces, I'm thinking of, for example, Primo Levi, the book is written by a man of 39, an intellectual, as opposed to a narrative through the eyes of a young boy, which the narrative tends to be somewhat naive and perhaps a little overly optimistic. And he is, because he is who he is able to insert into this narrative his thoughts about major issues that are questions, if you want, that one is confronted with. For example, how is it that Germans, this nation of thinkers, of musicians, of scientists, how could they descend to this level of barbarity? So, tell you a little bit about my own relationship to the book. I was born in 1951, and of course, in the beginning, all I could see was this little book. It is a book of only about 250 pages. I didn't really know what it was about, but I did notice how reverently my parents and others who would take it out of the bookshelf to look at it at the library. And that always stayed with me. Of course, as I grew older and I understood how the story of that book had an impact on our family. And the book, unfortunately, was written in this obscure language, Hungarian, and not even Hungarian in Hungary. It wasn't published in Hungary. We can talk about that later, why that didn't happen. And also Serbo-Croatian, another pretty obscure language. And for 74 years, it was lost to the world. About 3.5 years ago, when I retired, I decided to do something about it. I found the right translator. I found the right literary agent, and we worked very hard to bring the book out to the world. And could we have the next slide? In January of 2024, it came out simultaneously in English, in London, and in New York, Penguin Random House and Macmillan. And it immediately got tremendously positive coverage across all media, all political shades of opinion, very widespread. And not only that, it was picked up by many other publishers in other countries. So if we could have the next slide, please. We have the book now in 10 languages, and I think there's a display. Oh, it's out there. There are samples of the books. I've ticked off the languages in which it's available now. It will be available in 6 more languages in the next few months. And we are hoping that by January 27th, 2025, which is the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, it will be available in 16 languages. The book, as I said, was published by a number of very prestigious publishers. One of them is Penguin Random House. By the way, could we have the next slide? It's available as an ebook. It's available as audio. It's also now coming as a paperback. Penguin Random House is bringing it out in its vintage Red Stripe series. And this is the book, these are the books that they consider the most important that they have ever published. And you can see some of the things, some of the books that they have, To Kill a Mockingbird, Gulag Archipelago, and the next one is going to be Cold Crematorium. So let me tell you a little bit about my uncle's life before he wrote the book. So I mentioned he was born in Budapest, which in 1905, Budapest at that time was the co-capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, together with Vienna. At the end of World War I, there was a white terror counter-revolution, very anti-Semitic, very violent, and the family fled to the neighboring kingdom of Yugoslavia that already had a significant Hungarian minority. He finished high school in a small provincial town, Sombor, and he started his journalistic career at a regional newspaper in Subotica. And he was very prolific. He was clearly very talented, and his name, his reputation spread back to Budapest. And this is one of those stories, personal stories, but also it's a story of the ups and downs that Jews have experienced in many times, in many places around the world. Things get better, then they get worse, then they get better, then they get worse. So all of a sudden, I shouldn't say all of a sudden, for a while, anti-Semitism receded in Hungary. He was actually recruited to come back to Budapest and take on a new position. This was in 1932. Unfortunately, this honeymoon was short-lived. By 1938, Hungary started instituting new decrees against the Jews. He lost his job, and he had to return to Yugoslavia. Now, the worst was still to come. Could we have the next slide, please? On April 6, 1941, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was attacked by Nazi Germany and the surrounding countries allied with Germany. Resistance was crushed very quickly within 2 weeks, and the country was carved up. For the Jews of Yugoslavia, for most of them, it was a death sentence. Of the pre-World War II population of 82,000, 67,000 were murdered. Of course, people in Europe had experienced anti-Semitism before. What was different here was there was nowhere to escape. The world's gates were closed. Britain was closed. The U.S. was closed. Canada was closed. Everything was closed, even the British Mandate of Palestine that had been promised to the Jewish people as a haven. That was closed, and it doomed many people. For example, part of my mother's family from today's Bosnia, from Sarajevo, had already bought land in Palestine. When the Arabs revolted, the British caved in and forbid all any additional Jewish immigration. Now, if we could have the next slide, please. I'm sorry, can you just go back one slide? Thank you. So, so my uncle József and his parents found themselves in this area called Bachka. This is the area inside that red oval, and this was occupied and then annexed by Hungary, and they and the other Jews of Bachka suffered the same fate as the 700,000 Jews in Hungary proper. So starting in March of 1944, they were deported to death camps, primarily to Auschwitz. And if we could go now to the next slide. József, you can see there, that's József on the left, that's his wife Lenka, and my paternal grandparents, that's Sidonia and Fabian. The last three were murdered upon arrival, and of course we will hear about József. If we could go to the next slide, please. If we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. I wanted to give you the geography of his journey. So this is a map of Central Europe, what was called Greater Germany in 1944. And so we start off from occupied Hungary, that's number one. They are transported to location 2, that's Auschwitz, where everybody goes through the infamous selection. And then József is transported to area 3. This is a string of slave labor camps in the, today this is Poland, in Silesia. And he's there in various camps until liberation by Soviet troops in the first week of May 1945. Now, before we move to the next slide, I want you to take a good look at this map. If we could have the map back again. Could we have that map back again? Okay. So I don't know if you can read, but there's a box there, and it says, solid squares represent select camps. Because of map scale, not all camps can be shown or labeled. So first, you should realize, so each of these camps is actually a cluster of camps. In addition to that, this is not where most of the camps were. Most of the camps are further east. They're in Russia, they're in Poland, they're in Romania, they're in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and so on. Historians today know that there were over 42,500 places where Jews in occupied Europe were ghettoized, were shot, were deported, were killed, murdered, and otherwise impacted. This is what József called the land of Auschwitz. If we could have the next slide, please. So this is the infamous arrival ramp at Auschwitz. So these people have been traveling for a few days, locked up in these rail cars, cattle cars, no food, no water, and many of them are dead when they come. The dead are pulled out. the prisoners who are still alive are separated into columns, some to the right, but most to the left. And to encourage more of the prisoners to go to the left, the Germans offer that that the ones on the left can ride by truck rather than go by foot to the next destination. Of course, to some of the half-dead, half-crazed prisoners, this sounds appealing. And here's what József writes. He says, "Even I make an involuntary movement. That's when one of the carts carrying the dead turns closer to us. It rattles past between the two columns a few steps away. The prisoner beside the shoulder bar does not look at us, but I can hear his subdued voice. Stay here. Go only by foot, only by foot." József obeys some instinct and follows the advice and goes to the right. We know what happened to the ones who went to the left. They went to the gas chambers and then to the crematoria, and at Auschwitz, as many as 12,000 Jews a day, 12,000 Jews a day were murdered. If we could go to the next slide. So my uncle is one of the quote-unquote lucky ones. So he has been sent to a life of slave labor. This is what his place of employment would looked like. They were building this underground city, and this was supposed to be Hitler's last stronghold if they had to flee Berlin. And the process of becoming a slave started with losing their identity. And I'm going to play just a short clip how József describes that. Could we have that clip, audio clip?
33031. That's my number. Starting now, I'm no longer me, but 33031. Much more a number than, say, an inmate with a life sentence, whose identity and possessions are kept in a prison office. I was never one for numbers. I didn't believe in their magic. My measure of value has always been words. My capacity to remember numbers is so weak that I've forgotten my own phone number at times. And yet, now, the sole distinguishing mark of my future existence is etched into me within moments. The family and given names among the voluminous data on my birth certificate, and the nicknames by which my mother and my sweetheart once called me disappear. 33031 is what I'm called from now on. In this alone, and in nothing else, am I different from 74516 or 125993.
If we could have the next slide, please. Few of the Jewish slaves survived more than 3 or 4 months. This is what József said. I'm on my feet 17 hours a day, at least 14 of those in back-breaking labor. The highlight of their day was when they would get the food. This is how he talks about it. Greedily, practically without chewing, I swallowed down my bread. Each portion has precisely enough calories, just enough nutrient, absolutely necessary to maintain life. When the prisoner drops dead, the securely locked trains will spew out more well-fattened, fresh goods. So these slaves were not investment. They were expendable supplies. So take a look at these skeletal figures. These are the Jewish slaves who were still strong enough to work that had been newly liberated by Soviet troops. Now, that's not what my uncle would have looked like. So if we could have the next slide. This unfortunate person is being examined by a Soviet doctor. This is what my uncle would have looked like. He was near death. So you could ask, well, how did he survive? And the answer is that in the very last few months, the local Nazi commanders changed the directive before then was, if the slave drops, he goes into the gas chamber. These commanders, realizing that the war was coming to a close and thinking that they may be held personally accountable for the crimes. In fact, we know later on that none of that actually happened. But they thought they might be held personally accountable. Rather than sending the slaves no longer able to work directly to the gas chambers, they sent them to so-called hospitals to die in droves. They basically left them on planks. They didn't have any clothes. They cut their rations. They beat them. And they introduced typhus by bringing infected prisoners from other camps. And my uncle was in one such prison hospital called Dornhout. That was from where he was liberated. And he says in the book, I am burning in the Cold Crematorium, and hence the title for the book, because the prisoners call these places the Cold Crematorium. Now, this was undoubtedly the low point of my uncle's 14 months journey through the land of Auschwitz, and I want to read you just one short paragraph. The night belongs to struggling moans, screaming farewells, and delirious wails for home. Come here, you visionaries who create with pen, chalk, stone, or paintbrush, all of you who have ever sought to conjure up the grimace of suffering and death, prophets of the danse macabre, engravers of terror, scribes of hells, come here. If we could have the next, and this is my last slide. My uncle is buried in the Jewish cemetery in Belgrade, which is today the capital of Serbia, was the capital of Yugoslavia. And on the footstone of this monument is a poem which he wrote right after the war and which appears at the beginning of Cold Crematorium. And I want to read these last 3 verses because I really think it captures his experience and leads us into his life after the war. What's winter or the summer for when my mother's murderer still lives and thrives a fascist? He may yet live or he may not. He may yet breathe and stuff his gut. The priest might have absolved him. All his guilt is in the past. He finds a new uniform at last and poses where he killed her. Józsi instinctively grasped that the perpetrators would try to hide using new uniforms, and he spent much of the rest of his life writing about his experiences. So I hope this gives you a feel for the book and a context for our discussion.
Alex, thank you so much for sharing this story with the world and for sharing the story with us tonight. I'm sure a lot of us have questions about your uncle and your family and the story, but I'm going to stay with this theme of humanity because we learned a lot about things that happened to your uncle and what you share with us so far. But let's start with, who was he as a person? Tell us what you know about, I mean, you knew him. His personality, what were his enjoyments? And we'll start with before the war. He lived for 39 years. He was married. Who was he? What were his dreams of what he wanted his life to be before these awful times?
Sure. Is this on? Yes. Yeah, it is on. Okay. So you're right. I did know him, but I didn't know him before the war. So this is secondhand. So I mentioned that he came from a family that had fled Budapest. When I think of his childhood and my father's childhood, I think there are two descriptions or two words that come to mind. The first is poverty, and the second is love. Poverty, and I don't mean that there weren't people who were poorer than they were, but they were constantly in economic uncertainty. My paternal grandfather was a wonderful cabinet maker, really an artist, but he was a terrible businessman. My sister Vanda translated a wonderful short story of József's where he describes how the family every Friday would have to scrounge around try to collect funds from unpaid bills from customers, because my grandfather would make these wonderful esoteric things that people with money didn't want. And so only the most bohemian people like him, who also didn't have money, would buy. And of course, he would extend credit to everybody. So it was always a crisis. So there were tough economic conditions. And the three brothers, there were three brothers, they all three miraculously survived. They were itching to get out of that milieu. The other is love. In spite of the difficulties, there was much closeness, caring, and love in that family. Again, another short story of József talks about, it's called the four watches. So my grandfather he had very little, but he had a few things that he really cared for, and one was this watch, those old-fashioned watches and he lost it somehow. And so he didn't say anything, but the family members could see that he was really upset about it. And one Saturday night, or maybe it was Shabbat dinner, I don't know, at a dinner, József, he was the eldest, he comes up with a replica, the same, not the same, but similar watch, and he says, I know you missed the watch, and here it is. And then my father, and nobody knew what anybody else was doing. He somehow scraped together the funds. He also had a watch. And the third one, who was even younger, he somehow scraped. So there were three watches. There were actually four. The wife had also scraped together money for the watch, but she waited until the next week to give it to him. So, as I said, József wanted to get out of there. He was very talented. His talent was recognized immediately. He wrote poems, he wrote short stories, dramas, plays, and he was doing well. He was, on his way. He got married, and then, he was let go because of the Hungarian anti-Jewish legislation, and of course, then the war.
You talked for a little bit in the presentation about these slave labor camps, and I want to spend a moment talking about that because I think many of us who've experienced Holocaust literature and film, we're more familiar with the experience of those who were only there for a short period of time. They went to the rights, they went to the gas chambers, and that was their story. But as you mentioned, there were 42,500 of these labor camps around Central and Eastern Europe. Help us understand what the purpose of those camps were in addition to the terrorization of the Jewish people and other prisoners. What were they there? What labor was to be done, and for whom was it being done?
Yeah, so just to clarify a little bit, 42,500 doesn't refer just to camps. These are camps, places of deportations, ghettos. So this whole process, the ultimate result, the ultimate aim was death. Not a single Jew was to stay alive. But while they were alive, the ones who were strong enough, they can be used. They were expendable. They could be used. They could be worked to death.
And was that just for the Nazi war machine, or was it for like businesses? Who were they? Who was benefiting from this labor?
Well, so one of the things that József speaks about, and others have pointed out, and it's been overlooked, unfortunately, in generally in history, is that German industry. All these great names that we have today. Think of. By the way, the people in the back. Can you hear me? Okay. Yes? Okay. Siemens, Bayer, Deutsche Bank, Mercedes-Benz, all of these used slave labor, without exception, all of them. The German industry was an absolutely vital part of the war machine. So to answer your question, most of the slaves worked in the war industry.
What struck me about the book was how immediately it opens and how immediately it closes, right? There's the reason why I asked you to talk about his life before the war is because you don't get any of it from reading the book. It starts at the moment of deportation, and it ends essentially at the moment or the moments after the liberation. And so in those 14 months, the experiences he had were just so depraved, so much depravity in what was going on. And in reading it, and as a person who's our community, right, we immerse ourselves in Jewish tradition, I couldn't help but be reminded of a teaching that we read from Pirkei Avot that says that in a place where there are no human beings, try to be a human being. And as we've talked about a few times, the lack of humanity that was on display was so challenging. And I'm curious whether he was, what his Jewish education was like, and where did he find the strength to maintain his humanity among all these people who had lost it?
Okay, so there are a few questions embedded in that. His Jewish background, they knew they were Jews, but they were secular Jews, but Jews who knew Jewish history. And of course, if they had forgotten it for a second, the environment would remind them. Just as an example, when they were children, I mentioned that all three brothers wanted to get away and get out of the house, not because they didn't love their parents, but because they wanted a better life. So my father was very ambitious. At age 5, he started first grade. He had to walk hours, extra hours, every day in order to get to the primary school, not because it was so far away, but because he had to go around these ethnic German villages where, had he gone through them, he would have been beaten up. So the environment was reminding them who they were. Now, to go back to, yes, the camps were a place of incredible inhumanity. József describes how father and son would fight over a morsel of bread. I mean, just, incredible things. And yet there were sparks of humanity. I'll just mention a few. So one, when they arrive at Auschwitz, by the way, my uncle was a heavy smoker, and he was addicted. And so he really needed his fix. And when they arrived, at Auschwitz, they went by a whorehouse, and one of the prostitutes that was there for the SS took pity on him, and she lit a cigarette and she dropped it right in front of him so that he could smoke. There was a Jewish doctor, Farkas, who, if it hadn't been for him, I don't think József would have survived. And he worked under appalling conditions. He even stole drugs from the German pharmacy, and this was, of course, at his, he could have been murdered for it had he been found out. Another person was Herman, an SS guard from, I forgot where, but he was a bartender. And József speaks about Herman would go around and he would literally light one cigarette, drop it, move a little further, light another cigarette, drop it. He would sort of sow a field. And he wrote, I'm paraphrasing, even today, so this is after 5 years, he says, whenever I think of Herman, this feeling of gratitude wells up in my chest. So yes, there were. Now, it's hard to be a judge. You just, when you're in those circumstances, it's impossible to say how you would have acted. József is very honorable, his story is very honorable. He didn't do anything dishonorable, but there were many who were despicable, including Jews who would, in exchange for a little more food or some other privilege, food was really this was the big driver, basically for food, would brutalize their fellow Jewish inmates.
When the war started, he was 39, he was married, his wife, his parents were murdered.
Yeah, just correct. Yeah, that was 41.
Sorry.
Yeah, 41, yeah. Mm-hmm.
The war ends.
Yeah.
Where does his life journey take him then?
So obviously there's convalescence. He is in various clinics. He finally is strong enough to restart his career. He goes back into journalism. He writes for the Hungarian language newspapers. He's also on the Hungarian language radio. He has a successful career. Much of, well, I shouldn't say much, but a significant part of what he writes about is connected directly or indirectly to the Holocaust. So, for example, he wrote a series of short stories about traveling to various European cities, and in many of them, he doesn't use this phrase, I just made this up, Holocaust amnesia. How these people in, for example, Austria, they have Holocaust amnesia of different type. So that was, especially in the beginning, his first literary works after the war were poems. And the poems, they're very emotional. The first collection has one I remember very carefully. It's called I Speak with My Father. And it has a line in there, it says, who is going to avenge him? Don't the heavens rage? He was enraged, red hot rage. He realized very soon that people would find new uniforms. The Cold War started. Yugoslavia broke with Stalin. There were all kinds of political things. Nobody really cared about the Jews. What else can I tell you about his life? He was a very gentle person, especially with me. He had many hobbies. He taught me to play chess. We listened to soccer on radio. He was diminished. He never remarried. But he didn't give up, and much of his life, as I think I mentioned, was devoted to basically fighting denial, fighting trivialization of the Holocaust. He was particularly vehement about the Yugoslav war criminals who had found refuge in Italy, Austria, and Germany, and those who had been helped by the Vatican to flee to South America.
I want to turn now to the story of the publication of the book and
Okay.
its writing. So let's start with, when was the book written? When did he write it?
He wrote it, he probably started in 1947. He finished it in 1949, and it was published in 1950 in Hungarian, in Yugoslavia.
And what was the reception?
Yeah, the reception was excellent. I read one of the reviews, or an excerpt from one of the reviews, but it never got out of that little, I think I mentioned it, there were 2 obscure languages, never was able to get out of there, primarily because of politics. The logical first place that it would have gone to would have been Hungary. But Tito and Stalin had broken. Hungary was firmly in the camp, the Soviet camp. They didn't want anything from Yugoslavia, so that was closed. More importantly, even it hadn't been closed, showing the Jews as the unique targeting of Jews of the Holocaust. You know, in other words, the Jewish uniqueness of the Holocaust was taboo in Eastern Europe. It may be hard to understand, but until communism fell, you could go to Auschwitz. The word Jew didn't appear there. You would have no idea that these were Jews. In fact, it said people from all over Europe were brought here and they were murdered, when 90% of the 1.1 million people who were brought there and murdered were Jews, and they were murdered because they were Jews. But you may ask, well, what about world languages? How about English?
I want to make sure I got that story clear, because there's a
Okay.
lot there. So the war is over, and there was a temporary political alignment between Yugoslavia and Russia, between Tito and Stalin, and then they had a falling out.
In 1948.
So the book was not exported into the USSR because of that political disagreement. But even if it hadn't have happened, I think you said
Right.
that the specific telling of the story of the Holocaust as a
Jewish
attack on the Jewish
tragedy.
people would have prevented it from being published in that
Yes.
case. Okay.
Okay.
So that's why it didn't go east.
Okay.
Now let's go west.
Okay.
Why didn't it come to the west?
Right. So, my father was a official of the Yugoslavian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he was posted in Washington, D.C. right in this time, starting in 1950. And he tried very hard to get U.S. publishers to translate and publish the book, and he was rebuffed at every point. And the reason was they found it too pro-Soviet. They didn't like some of the language. They didn't like the fact that, for example, at the end of the book, the prisoners are leaving the camp and they're singing the Communist Manifesto. I'm sorry, not the Communist Manifesto, the Communist Anthem, the Internationale. This was the time of Cold War, 1950s, early 1950s. People were petrified of McCarthyism. They didn't want to show sympathy for the Soviets. And the Jewish publishers were the worst. They were the most scared. This was the time of the Rosenbergs, of the Rosenberg trials. So that's the reason it did not.
So give some more. Let's get some more context there. I think we understand why a pro-communist message would have been problematic and instill fear in American publishing houses. But help us understand how that became part of the story. What was it that prompted the prisoners to have those pro-Soviet feelings in the story?
Well, if you look at, let's take Yugoslavia, and you look at who fought the Nazis and who didn't fight the Nazis. The people who fought the Nazis were the communists. Everybody else was, either allied with the Nazis or was standing by. It was very clear. And by the way, I guess I should also, you asked me about the family before the war. One thing I didn't, I think in part because they were so poor, they were, I don't know if they would call them socialists, I don't know if they were members of the Socialist Communist Party, but they were definitely inclined towards socialism. And you can see that in József's writing, both before the war and after the war.
And just to put us back for 1 second, in the 30s and early 40s, those identities or identifications could have had someone targeted by the Nazis because of their beliefs, right? And before the Cold War began, being a socialist, being a communist, even to many Americans, wasn't seen nearly as problematic as it became 15, 20 years later, right? So it was that reality, though, that afterwards, when we get to the publication of the book, that became so problematic to get it published in the States. Is that, am I reading that right? Did I wander in my question?
Yeah.
So the 30s and the 40s, when you, as you talked about your uncle, your family having socialist alignments, not necessarily hardcore members, but that was not as problematic politically in America in the 30s and 40s. The socialists and the communists were targeted by the Nazis as well. It really became a problem in the 50s with the Red Scare and McCarthyism.
Yes.
And so he wouldn't have thought twice about including that necessarily in his family's story when he wrote the book in the 40s, but then trying to get it published in America in the 50s, it was really problematic that it was in there.
Yeah, but the book was only published in Hungarian in 1950, so it was already the Cold War.
It was already the Cold War. And so then trying to export it and then into the U.S., that was where it ran into trouble. So then how did we get it published now? I mean, obviously it's a different political era, but tell us a little bit about, we'll end with this, which is the story of his publication.
So basically, as I think I mentioned, I decided after I retired, I vowed to myself that this is an important story. It's a beautiful story. It's important for history. It's important for our family. I got to do something about it. And I realized early on the only way of getting it published was to translate it, get a first-rate translation. Because there are many Holocaust stories. There were fewer in 1950, but now there are many more. But what's unique about this is the language. And how do you convey that? You have to convey it by translating, and you have to find the right translator. I worked very hard. I actually set up a little competition among various Hungarian to English translators who had experience with this type of genre. I had them translate a paragraph. Anyway, not to spend too much time on that, I was very lucky to work with somebody who did a remarkable job. I think I mentioned to somebody before we came here, a translated work is really a synthesis of the original and the input of the translator. And Paul Olshvari did a wonderful job. He made it both true to the original, but he also made it fresh. And I worked very closely with him to add little explanatory phrases and to find the right, especially Hungarian. Hungarian is a notoriously difficult language to translate. And you can choose for any word, there are many words that you could choose to translate the original word to. And we worked very hard to get the right tone that would not be foreign to the American English speaker who is living in today and knows very little or anything about Central Europe in the 1940s.
Well, he did a phenomenal job. For those who haven't read the language of the book, it just jumps right off the page. So I'm going to ask one final question, then we'll have a time for a couple of questions from the audience. And so the question is, you vowed to bring this story to a modern audience for a whole bunch of reasons, and in part because you felt it was an important story to be heard. Here we are almost a century later. what messages do you hope that not only today's readers, but our grandchildren who will read this story, what message do you hope they take away from reading this?
Well, I think there are two main points. I think the first one is truth. My uncle wanted to bear witness to history. He wanted to show it as it was. He didn't want to sugarcoat it. In fact, he had very little patience with these feel-good Holocaust stories and movies and plays that came out. And he wanted people to know the truth. He was very concerned about trivialization of the Holocaust, denial of the Holocaust, the appropriation of Jewish suffering, the universalization of the Holocaust. So I think this is an antidote, a bulwark against that. I think the other is a warning to humankind, and the warning is what can happen when you have fanaticism, when you have an ideology that is absolutely fanatical. He writes at one point, he said, I'm paraphrasing, Napoleon's soldiers had in their knapsacks Marshall's batons. Hitler's Philistines carried castrating knives. So what he was trying to say is, in other armies, the soldiers wanted glory, they wanted to plunder, maybe they wanted to rape, but these were, of course, the German Nazis wanted to do all of that too. But the ultimate goal was murder. And that's fanaticism.
If you have a question, Julie's going to come around and hand a note card. Do we have one over here? Let me say this. Who would like to ask a question? I think we can probably dispense. We've got only a couple. Sir, ask your question loudly. I can repeat it into the microphone. So just because we have an audience who's watching the live stream so they can hear, the question is, did József ever consider making Aliyah and moving to Israel?
Not that I know of. I know my parents did, and actually half of the surviving Yugoslav Jews in 1948, Tito made an exception to who could emigrate from the workers' paradise. And Jews were allowed to go to Israel. They had to give up all their belongings. I know my parents considered it. I don't know whether József ever did. I suspect in 1948 he was still not up to anything.
So the question was whether the book has been shared with the current Jewish communities in Budapest or in other parts where your family's history took place.
Well, I've been touched with indirectly through the Jewish Book Council. I'm on their list of this year's authors. I'm going out to California, for example, in 2 weeks. If you have names, organizations, please share with me. I'm doing a lot of both in-person and Zoom presentations.
Yes. So So the question for those who might have heard was, as the author refers to the fear that those who perpetrated these would put on new uniforms later in life and be able to go about their business and live their lives, was there a concern that these events would be performed by people wearing other uniforms later in life in different eras and different times?
Well, absolutely, but he didn't have to wait for these times. He died in 1978, so it's hard to, speculate what he would think about some, specific issue right now. But he, none of these, with the exception of Nuremberg trials, and I do a much more in-depth presentation. I have a chart which shows the number of people who are thought to have been directly, this is in Germany, directly involved in the murder of Jews. I'm not talking about the person who is the train master, the station master at the station that is deporting Jews. Historians believe that between 250,000 and 1 million Germans were complicit. And then they worked through how many of these were brought to trial, how many were convicted, what sort of sentence they got. The bottom line is only 164 were convicted and of murder and got a death sentence. Some of those death sentences were commuted. So the answer is, yeah, he saw it. He was there, but he lived between 1945 and 1978, and he saw that that the companies were getting away scot-free, the Daimler-Benzes, Mercedes-Benz, all of these, Audis, and it was for political reasons. The truth, the hard truth is that the Holocaust would not have been possible without the collaboration of local populations. And to go after them, remember, again, the Cold War, people didn't care about the Jews. They were trying to get people to be on their side, whether it was the East or the West, persecuting or prosecuting the criminals, Nazi criminals, was not an effective strategy. I mean, you would have to jail a good chunk of the local populations.
We have time for one more question, and then we're going to have Oneg afterwards, and there'll be a chance if you have a question to ask Alex directly, you can. Debbie?
Oh, it's really not a question. I just want to let you know that I listened to the Audible of the book, and it was phenomenal. I don't know if I could have read it, but listening to the person reading the book, I couldn't tear myself away from it. So I just encourage you, if you want to download Audible and listen to the book, it's really an amazing experience.
Alex, would you share the name of the reader for the audio version and what else he's done?
Well, I think you should just Google Cold Crematorium. You will, all the major publishers and bookstores, Google Books, they all, have a website, and you will see the audio. The reader is called Lawrence Dobiege. He's fantastic. And by the way, you can go to the Macmillan site as an example, and you can listen to the first chapter if you want to. It's for, free.
I think that's about as good a spot as any for us to end our group conversation. I want to thank our friends of music and arts for helping support this, not only this program, but a variety of programs, all the ones that Cantor Lori mentioned at the beginning of the program. I want to thank the members of our technical team who helped bring tonight to fruition, to thank all of you for joining us this night, and of course, to Alex Bruner, thank you so much for sharing of your time and your family's story. Please join us in the hall.